Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alicia, and today we're going to be going over my January wrap-up. I always leave timestamps down below in case there's any part of the video you want to jump to. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that if you're here to watch the Spanish version of this video, I'll go ahead and link it up in the cards. I also briefly wanted to mention, if you're not subscribed but you like my content, please go ahead and subscribe. Did you know that 70% of you that watch my videos are not subscribed to my channel? I put in a lot of effort into filming and editing, and so if you do like the content, please go ahead and subscribe and leave a comment. That lets me know that you like my videos. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So today we're going to be talking about the books that I read in January, and I apologize ahead of time if this is a chaotic video. It feels like I read these books years ago. So let's start off talking some stats. In the month of January, I read a total of 10 books, and I DNF'd 1. 9 of those books were fiction, 1 was nonfiction. 9 of those books were geared towards adults, 1 was a young adult book. 4 books were fantasy, 4 were contemporary, and 2 were romance. In terms of star breakdown, I gave 2 books 3 stars, I gave 2 books 3.5 stars, I gave 2 books 4 stars, and I gave 4 books 5 stars. So overall, I had a really good reading month in January. So why don't we start talking about the DNF? Just getting it right out of the way. The book that I DNF'd in the month of January was The Stand by Stephen King. And this saddened me because I read half of this book, and this was like a 1,400 page book. So I got like 600 pages in, and I was actually genuinely enjoying it. I liked the plot line, I liked the characters, and I was just really intrigued to find out what happened. I know this is a lot of people's favorite books, but the reason I just couldn't continue is because there's a lot of profanity in here, which I don't mind at all actually in my books. I don't mind profanity, but there's also some subtly racist and even some overtly racist comments that are made in here or passages, and I just couldn't continue in good faith having to read passages like that, so I did go ahead and DNF it. So I thought for this wrap up, I'll go ahead and talk about the books in the order that I read them. So the first book that I actually finished in the month of January is Luster by Leilani. I ended up giving Luster a 4 out of 5 stars. This is a debut and I absolutely adored it. It's written in present tense first person, which threw me a little off at the beginning because I don't read a lot of books in present tense first person, but the writing style was just so digestible and so straightforward that I really felt connected to Evie, who is our main character. I know this is a book that is not going to be for everybody, but I really enjoyed it. It's a little bit dark, a little bit sassy, and I loved our main character. In Luster, we follow a morally gray character named Edie, who is in her early 20s, and she's trying to figure out her life. She's making what some may call inappropriate sexual choices, and she is in a relationship with a married man called Eric, who is in an open marriage. But when Edie gets fired from her current job, she is welcomed into Eric's house by his wife, and she begins to form a relationship with their daughter. As I mentioned earlier, this is a book that is not going to be for everybody, but I just loved how gritty and raw and relevant this book is. I felt like I understood Edie, and I felt like I understood her motivation. There's really no plot in this. I know that is one of the biggest criticisms of this book, is that it's very plotless. It's really more about this character and being in her mind and finding out her motivation, and just exploring what it's like to be 20-year-old something who doesn't know what's going on in her life and doesn't know what to do with her life. And so I definitely enjoyed it. I loved it. I will be reading anything Leilani puts out. The next book that I finished in the month of January was an ARC that was provided to me by NetGalley in exchange for an honest review. That was Just the Two of Us by Ryu Hyang, and this is a contemporary romance novel. I did end up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars, and in this one we follow our main character Soo-yuk, who just traveled to Korea and is trying to learn more about his birth parent. He's an emergency pediatric doctor who is just solely focused on his work. Soo-yuk loves his job, and he's someone who doesn't really vocalize or show emotion. Also follow our other main character, Yuna, who is a chef who makes boxed lunches in Korea, and the two inevitably end up meeting and a romance ensues. This is definitely a slow burning romance, and I love that we got to explore each character individually, learning about their traumas and their motivations and how they focused on healing healing and really finding themselves. There's also tons of talk about food and Korean food. I found myself to be extremely hungry whenever I picked up this book because the description of food was just delicious. I think this is going to be a good book for someone that already loves K-dramas because it is very K-drama-esque. It's definitely such a quirky and cute romance, so if you're someone who likes K-dramas, I think this is one that you'll like. The next book that I finished in the month of January is City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett, and this is the first installment to the Divine Cities trilogy. I ended up giving City of Stairs a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and it's definitely a series that I'm going to continue. This is a genre-bending book. It's epic fantasy with sci-fi, mystery, thriller elements, but it also gave me like spy thriller vibe. The concept behind it is also extremely creative, and the world building was fantastic. City of Stairs definitely starts off in this whodunit type of mystery setting with a fantasy background. So in this book, we follow our main character, Shara, who has come into Bulikov and is trying to figure out why the culture ambassador that lived there was murdered. We learn early on that Bulikov is a city that was once ruled by gods who had magic powers and helped the city thrive. However, in years past, a Sepuri called Kaj ended up coming into Bulikov and killing off all of the gods, and now Sepuri is this thriving city. As Shara is investigating the murder of the cultural ambassador, she starts telling that maybe not all the gods in Bulikov are dead, and from there the story unravels. I definitely really enjoyed this book. It was one that once I got into it, I just kept wanting to read and read and read and read. It's really funny and witty, and I found myself to be really excited. I do have to say that it took me a couple of chapters to get into, primarily because the first couple of chapters were very info dumpy to me, and I had a hard time orienting myself. But once you get past that, the characters are fun, the setting is creative, the world building is creative, and I just found myself really drawn to the book. Around halfway through, for some reason, I felt my excitement diminishing, and I'm not exactly sure why. The only thing that I can think of is that certain parts of the book felt clunky and some things felt like they didn't fit together, and that's probably why it contributed to the feeling of me having diminished excitement over the book. But overall, I still think it's a great creative book, and I'm definitely going to continue on with the series. The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of January is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 stars, but the more I think of it, this is closer to a 3-star for me. I know this book is beloved by a lot of people, and if it really works for you, I'm so happy that it did. It just didn't work for me. In it, we follow our main character, Nora, who is struggling with her life. Her cat just died, she was recently fired, and she doesn't seem to have any genuine connections with her family or any friends. And so she finds this midnight library that's between life and death, and essentially she's able to test out different lives and what could have been if she made different choices in her life. I thought this book and the concept of it was extremely intriguing and creative, but I think for me, it lacked in the execution of it. It kind of felt like a self-help book disguised as a novel. This was a buddy read on Andy's channel, and we did have a live show, so I'll go ahead and link that down below in case you want to get different perspectives, because some people really adored it. But for me, it missed the mark. It just had this overly optimistic view that essentially said, if you try harder or if you do things the right way, then your life is going to go well. And I think that's an oversimplified view of life. And it kind of felt like Nora's existence was in a vacuum of controlled problems. I think the book for me also missed the mark in that it doesn't take into account that certain people have privileges that other people don't. And because of that, you may be limited in the choices that you can make. So given this oversimplified view of how you can go about your life is not necessarily applicable to everybody. And it's not something that everybody can relate to. I wish I could have loved it, but I didn't. The next book that I finished in the month of January is I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer. And this was my nonfiction read. It's a true crime novel about the Golden State Killer who ended up killing women in Southern and Northern California. And I thought this book was a wild ride. I did listen to it on audiobook, but the writing was fantastic. The research was thorough and in-depth. I'm from California, and I've lived both in Southern and Northern California. I ended up learning tons of history about my home state. It also definitely made me cautious of home invasions. Before I go to sleep now, I have to go around and lock all my windows and turn on the lights and make sure that no one can get in. Overall, I thought this book was great. It was well researched, well written, and if you're into true crime, this is one I highly recommend. The next book that I ended up reading in the month of January is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second book to Mistborn Era 1, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Absolutely adored it. I can't really give you much on the plot because I don't want to give any spoilers for the final empire, but what I can say is that you get more character development, especially of more of the side characters. You also get more extensive world building. We get more explanation of the magic system, and wow, the plot twist. There's so many plot twists in here. I know some people say that this suffers from the second book syndrome, I think it's called, but we got so much. There's so much that happens in this book. I know that the pacing is something that people have a problem with. It can be very slow and it can drag on. I am buddy reading this with my friend, the Book Pearl, and we are going to do a live show for the entire trilogy once we're both done. That should be sometime in April, but I'll give you the details later. The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of January is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Ryu Waubgeshig, and this is a haunting post-apocalyptic dystopian novel that centers around an indigenous community in Canada. This is own voices, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. This is a book that's definitely, again, not for everybody. The pacing can be very slow, and it's very character driven, and it's also very atmospheric. I ended up reading this when it was snowing here in Portland, and I would just read it and stare out the window, and I felt like I was there. It's definitely a slow build of suspense, and it focused primarily on the community members and how they're coming together to survive. In Moon of the Crusted Snow, we follow a small community of the Anishinaabe tribe in northern Canada after their reservation goes dark. They don't have any power, any electricity, and they start to realize that they might not get any of the food supplies that they usually get from outside. When 2 of their community members ended up coming back from the school they were attending, and they bring back stories that this is also happening in the larger town, they start to band together to try to survive this coming winter with limited food supplies, limited resources, and limited power and water. The strengths of this book really lies in the characters. They band together and try to figure out how they're going to make all of their resources last through the winter. But when an outsider, a white man, comes into a community requesting to be a part of it and to help them survive, things start to go a little south. Again, this is a very slow, intricately woven tale about community and about a sense of belonging, and it was great. I loved it. The setting, the characters, I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I ended up reading in the month of January is called Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. I did end up listening to this in audiobook format as well through Libby, and this book made me cry. I kid you not, once I was done with this book, I cried and sobbed for the next 30 minutes. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it now, but I think it's definitely an important and really great read. This is the only young adult novel that I ended up reading this month, and I love the way Tiffany D. Jackson ended up interweaving these very important and serious topics and themes into the book, but still geared them for a young adult audience. I also think that this is a book that a lot of adults can benefit from because there are a lot of darker and serious themes. So in the story, we follow our main character, Claudia, who has just come back from summer vacation. She spent it away from her best friend, Monday. They're inseparable most of the time. But when Monday doesn't show up to school for a couple of weeks, Claudia starts to wonder if her friend is in serious danger or if she's missing, and she starts to ask questions that other people aren't asking. That's really all I can say about this book because you just need to go into it and experience it and read it. Definitely look up trigger warnings before going into this because it was a very heavy and dark book. And like I said, it made me bawl. I cried at the end of this. It's definitely one that will spark discussion, and it's one that will spark empathy, and it's a book you need to read. Please read it. It's so good. And also so sad, and it's gonna break your soul. Next book that I ended up finishing in the month of January is You Had Me at Hola by Alexis Daria. This is a contemporary romance novel where we follow our 2 main characters, Jasmine and Ashton, who are both casted as the protagonists of a rom-com. Each of our 2 protagonists have their own motivations why they want the sitcom to succeed, and they end up not having a lot of chemistry on screen, so they decide to meet up outside of filming to really start to build that chemistry. And from there, you know, a romance ensues. I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed that we were able to really understand each of these characters. Their past and their motivations are explored, and we definitely see a lot of character development. I also really enjoyed that we got insight into the film industry from a Latinx perspective, what that looks like, what the barriers are, and how that plays into the romance in this book overall. I do want to point out that this does have Spanish terms and words interspersed throughout the plot. I know some people had trouble with that. I didn't because I do speak Spanish. But even if I didn't speak Spanish, it's a couple of sentences here and there, a couple of words here and there. You can simply Google them. So I didn't understand the negative backlash on this book for having Spanish in it. You can just look it up. There's other books that also have Spanish or French or other languages. You can easily look them up. But yes, overall, I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. If you're someone that likes shows like Jane the Virgin, or if you like telenovelas, I think this is one you might like. The last book that I ended up reading in the month of January is called The Vanished Birds, and this is by Simone Jimenez. And this is a sci-fi space opera. If you like Becky Chambers, I highly implore you to pick up this book. It's so good. It's very character driven. The pacing is extremely slow. It's definitely grittier than a lot of Becky Chambers' works, and because of that, there was this added layer of complexity. I do want to point out that we follow multiple points of views. We follow a timeline that spans a millennium, and there's different planets that we do visit. So it's definitely a dense book with a lot of information, a lot of characters, and a lot of different settings. So it can be a little bit overwhelming at first, but the writing is beautiful, the storytelling is complex and intricate, characters are nuanced and well developed. I absolutely loved this book. This is also definitely a book that does a lot of meandering, so if you don't like that, if you like a very straightforward plot, this is one that you might not enjoy because we do take a lot of exit. We do explore different characters and stories that don't necessarily impact our main plot. My foot fell asleep. Oh, my foot fell asleep. Oh. In our main plot line, we do follow our main character Nia, who is a captain of a transportation ship. And in one of the planets that she visits, one of her lovers ends up entrusting her with a boy. This boy ended up appearing on their planet just one day randomly. They don't know where he's from. He doesn't speak. He loves a flute and he loves to play music. That's all we know. So Nia ends up taking in the boy, trying to find out where he came from and who his parents and family are. But as the story goes on, we end up realizing that this boy may be more important than we were led to believe, and they might be in danger. The strength of this book is definitely the characters and the writing. I really ended up enjoying this book. Did I mention, by the way, that this is a debut? Like, what in the world for a debut? Like, even not for a debut, it's a great book. Like, I just don't understand how this is a debut novel. It's so good. So those were all of the books that I ended up reading in the month of January. Let me know down below if you're interested in any of them. What did you think about them? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!